this startup policy. And we really want to know the nuts and bolts, Minister. We know that you're extremely passionate about this sector. We know that you're on board in terms of what is happening with in the rest of the continent and the rest of the world in terms of making policies for startups. But we want to know what you are planning for our very first startup policy in the country. Following that, we will have a scene setter from Dr. Chintan Vaishnav, who is Mission Director or previously Mission Director at Atal Innovation Mission. We will then have a case study of the SA Startup Act movement from Mati Modisa, who is Vice Chairperson of Simodisa. We will have a panel discussion from experts who will be taking us through their perspectives in terms of what they are seeing across the world and across the continent. And then, as I said, this is quite action-orientated. Minister, we should have given you the spec to bring your sneakers. We will be having a breakaway session after the small comfort break, where we want to really tackle what this policy needs to entail. And this is your inputs that we're looking to harvest and garner from. So it's going to be an action-packed and action-orientated agenda up until 1 o'clock. We really hope that you are ready to roll up your sleeves and give us those inputs and really see yourself being present in this policy design. Just a small introduction in terms of who we are. Simodisa is a non-profit organization that is Secretariat of the SA Startup Act movement. We are an ecosystem builder that is joined by various organizations, the likes of the World Bank, African Arena, the JSE, and we are also sponsored by Allan, Gill, and very recently a 3-year partnership with Endeavour SA, really centered around removing the bottlenecks and unnecessary red tape to do with tech startups in terms of what they are facing. I mentioned that we started our journey 10 years ago, Minister, and that green little box that you see there at the bottom where you announced plans for startup policy is really something momentous to us. And so today we are celebrating that by hosting this global learning lab to design and co-design the startup policy framework with you. From our perspectives, when we're speaking about tech startups, and I think we are speaking about the same people who are here in the room, we follow recommendations of the OECD that really defines tech startups as entrepreneurs who grow at a quicker speed than any other typical MSME. They are within the first 5 years already growing to less than 100 million rand, up until unicorn status, and the various tech startups that we are seeing now in the fore. They come from this particular definition of what we recognize as a high growth tech startup to be. And these are types of entrepreneurs that really invest their resources in research and development, in ensuring that they've got the best tech talent, as we know, which is quite expensive to bring into the country, to bring into their businesses. And so our reforms are really centered around ensuring that they have got the best resources and the best investments financially as well to grow their enterprises. Leading up to this session, we asked you as participants that are going to be joining to us as to what are the top 3 policy barriers that are limiting you from growing in your tech business. 66% of you said that the most policy challenge that you are facing is policies related to accessing capital. I think it's quite a common barrier that we see across the various different sizes and sectors of businesses. Secondly, you said that the policy barrier that is affecting you as well is that of talent, skills, and employment, as well as access to enabling visas for you to be able to get that talent into your business. And lastly, 30% of you said that you are facing barriers to do with cross-border payments, as well as IP commercialization. Is that a true reflection of where you are in terms of your business journey? Okay, So, Minister, I hope that you take these insights as you design your policy to see that a lot of our entrepreneurs are really being throttled with regards to, at the very top, policies being related to access to capital. And we were just sharing earlier on with Grant from the Innovation Hub that a lot of the times it needs to do with sharing risk between the private sector and the public sector in terms of giving investments into these high growth tech startups, because these are business models that are often quite new. And so those incentives to enable more and more high network individuals to invest in them is what is going to take some of this data down. Before we get started into the nuts and bolts, we'd really love for you to join our growing movement. We've got at least 1,000 people, organizations and tech startups that are behind this initiative for us to get to where we are today, in the sense that we are able to call upon the Department of Small Business Development and the Minister herself to be with us in the room, is because we are going with the force that we are surrounded by with you today, and that is the organizations from the Lens Embrace of South Africa that have been with us over the past 10 years. So you are able to scan the QR code that you see on the left to join this growing movement that we have garnered over the past 10 years. You are also able to follow us in terms of the activities that we have in our WhatsApp group. Minister, you're more than welcome to join our WhatsApp group. How cool would it be if we had the Minister in our WhatsApp group? It'll surely be an active group. So you're able to join our WhatsApp group on the right as well, to keep abreast of our community and all the activities that we do. I would like to call upon Nomfundo Faith Dlamini, who is the head of ecosystem enablement at Allan and Gill Philanthropies, our long-standing partner, to give us a word of welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, Sanbonani. How are you guys today? Unfortunately, I didn't get the sneaker memo. Right. I think you and I are in the same WhatsApp group, Minister. Indeed. So good morning. Good morning to everyone. Honourable Minister, members of the Diplomatic Corps, DG Manzini, our esteemed colleagues, policymakers, founders, innovators, and of course our special guests. On behalf of Allan and Gill Philanthropies, it's my honor to welcome you to the G20 Startup Lab, a gathering that truly represents the power of collective intelligence, our global solidarity, and our shared commitment to building an enabling environment of entrepreneurship here in South Africa. Today we convene not merely to exchange ideas, but to also shape a national moment, one that places startups, innovation, and high-growth entrepreneurship at the center of South Africa's economic recovery and long-term developmental agenda. As we're all quite familiar, our country, like many other emerging countries, stands at a complex inflection point. We face structural unemployment, slow GDP growth, rising global competitive pressures, and persistent barriers for entrepreneurs who want to start, scale, and operate globally. Yet we also stand on the brink of an unprecedented opportunity. Our entrepreneurs are building solutions that respond to Africa's realities. Our youth represent one of the world's most dynamic talent pools. Our innovation ecosystems are maturing, and our country has, through the G20 presidency, committed to also designing and delivering a national startup policy. I don't know if the deadline is still March 2026, but I hope we hold it in that way. And this particular learning lab is therefore not just a theoretical exercise. It is part of a global obligation and a national developmental mandate. The purpose of today is actually quite simple, but also deeply ambitious: to shift from what should be done to how we will do it, together, collectively, with urgency, clarity, and shared ownership and contribution. The Startup Policy Learning Lab is a platform designed to help us co-develop actionable policy measures in partnership with the Department of Small Business Development, the grander ecosystem, and the global G20 peers. Secondly, to also position the SA Startup Act movement as a case study of ecosystem-led policy innovation and proof that bottom-up models can inform national policy reform. It is also to learn from the world, from Startup India, from UNESCO, from OECD, from G20 working groups, to ensure that South Africa's startup policy is globally relevant, yet locally rooted, and to produce a globally aligned policy brief that will directly shape South Africa's startup policy and contribute to G20 legacy outcomes. This gathering is not just a dialogue, it is a working session, a strategic lab, and a catalytic moment in our national policy journey. At Allan and Gill Philanthropies, our mission is anchored in undertaking principled, high-impact entrepreneurship by supporting talent and in strengthening entrepreneurial institutions so that together we can truly achieve collective impact. We believe fundamentally that entrepreneurship is one of the most important policy levers for inclusive economic growth and opportunity, not just for us, but also for the continent. Through our Allan Gray Orbis Foundation, we invest in the education and development of individuals with entrepreneurial potential within our Southern African region. Through E2, our impact investor, we invest in high-growth businesses, early-stage founders, and social enterprises in order for us to create youth entrepreneurship opportunities. And at Allan and Gill Philanthropies South Africa, we invest in the ecosystem. And as part of that, we collaborate with others, strengthen institutions through grant funding and non-financial resources, and are also committed to learning. We also implement our own programs as an organization in partnership with others, and our philosophy is fundamentally to never walk alone. Ecosystem building requires us to walk together, in tandem, to learn and to share, and to have the humility to know that we can't be good at everything, but we can support those that are exceptional in those particular areas, but providing the courage to test out new ideas and demonstrate scalable and replicable models to build a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem. Our role in supporting the national agenda includes strengthening high-growth entrepreneurs to have the potential to create meaningful jobs and scalable impact, by enhancing ecosystem enablement, by ensuring that our accelerators, our investors, our enterprises, our support organizations, and government partners work in a coherent and mutually reinforcing manner, by driving evidence, research, and policy intelligence to inform our decision-making, and increasingly supporting policy and regulatory reforms that remove our systemic barriers for entrepreneurship to thrive. And we convene today because we know that even the most talented founder cannot succeed if the environment around them is not conducive nor enabling. Philanthropy has the additive advantage in terms of being able to fund programs, but policy reforms in and of themselves change the system itself. And as a philanthropy rooted in long-term stewardship, we cannot speak about sustainability and scale without speaking about policy. For philanthropists, policy reform matters because it determines the oxygen of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. From visas to exchange controls, from tax incentives to procurement pathways. It influences the speed upon which and how it is that we also undertake scale in order for us to have impact. It ensures that innovation and entrepreneurship are not privileged spaces, and accessible pathways for diverse South Africans that we all represent here today. And perhaps also most importantly, policy reform is the foundation of systems change, the type of deep structural change that cannot be achieved through funding alone. A national startup policy gives us the opportunity to fix these root causes, unlock competitiveness, modernize our economic institutions, and also signal to the world that South Africa is serious about supporting innovation. And that is why the Learning Lab is so important. And that is why your presence here is also so invaluable. As we begin, I invite you to all adapt a particular mindset, one of co-creation and not consultation, one of shared responsibility and not siloed individualized mandates, of practicality over theory and of action over rhetoric. And by the end of the lab, I hope that we all walk away with a set of actionable policy levers that our department can refine, that they can test and also integrate into the startup policy framework. That we gain clarity on specific roles and institutional responsibilities, because policy alone only works when institutions are aligned and responsive. That implementation timelines and milestones are adhered to, and particularly as we look forward into the new year, and that a shared national commitment is obtained to ensuring that entrepreneurship becomes a true lever for economic transformation. And this space is designed for honesty, for constructive challenge, for innovation, imagination, and accountability. Your particularly lived experiences as founders, as policymakers, as entrepreneurs, as ecosystem builders, as researchers, is the most valuable resource that we have today. South Africa truly has everything it needs to build a globally competitive startup ecosystem. We bestow the talent, the creativity, we have the resilience, we have proven models, and now we also have a coordinated national effort to design a startup policy. But we cannot do it in isolation. We need the global lessons. We need to integrate the continental perspectives and the locally lived realities that each of you bring into this room today. And if we do our work well, this lab will not only shape policy, it will also shape Africa's entrepreneurial future and contribute to the legacy that we're trying to build. So without much further ado, it is now my privilege to also introduce a very esteemed leader who has demonstrated her unwavering commitment to the small business sector and to unlocking an enabling environment for entrepreneurs across the country. Our National Minister, Stellan Abrahams Ndabeni, the Minister of Small Business Development, has been a vocal champion to policy reform, ecosystem collaboration, and innovation-driven growth. Her leadership has been instrumental in South Africa's commitment to delivering a national startup policy and also positioning entrepreneurship as a strategic pillar of economic transformation. Minister Ndabeni, thank you for your vision, your partnership, your stewardship, as well as your steadfast dedication. We are honored to have you here with us and really excited to hear your sentiments. Please welcome, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Namfundo, and thanks to our director of the program, Pumzile. Allow me to take this opportunity to recognize all of you seated here, the speakers listed in the program, the panelists, the startups themselves that have made it possible for us to be here today. We would definitely not be here if it wasn't because of the work that you are doing. I know at times when you go through certain challenges, you're like, hey, maybe they don't recognize the importance of our existence, but trust me, everybody does, no matter where we are. Of course, I would recognize all the important stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, and I want to say, as I'm privileged to be standing here amongst the brains that can change how our economy, how our countries do things, because it is through the innovation that is provided by yourselves that determines how policies should look like. It is not the policy first, it is the innovation. That's why we can't afford to have stagnant policies. That's why at all times we talk of the importance of investing a lot in research and innovation. And of course, this is a great opportunity as we celebrate the 10 years, Simudisa, but also it's a great time for us as the country, president of the G Million, that kickstarted last week with the Startup 20, and of course the past 3 days with the social summit on the G20, and of course we are looking forward to the Leaders Summit, the people who take decisions, which will kickstart tomorrow until Sunday. And in the Startup 20, some of you did participate in it. There's lots of work that has been done which lay the foundation for the development of this policy. And we're clear as the department when we're mandated to coordinate the work of the engagement group on Startup 20, we said because there's going to be different brains and different segments of the tech startups and the other entrepreneurs. So let's utilize this opportunity, but make sure also that amongst the task forces, there are those that are specific in looking at certain areas that matter most. I say this knowing very well that the work, as it was mentioned by Phumzile, I don't know why you decided to put that picture. As it was mentioned by Phumzile, that you have gone through different stages. Firstly, let me outline the work that we do as the department, taking from the mandate that is listed on the coordination and promotion of entrepreneurship. That's why Nomfundo keeps on talking about the ecosystem, because you can never be able to coordinate if you don't recognize that there's an ecosystem. So you coordinate the ecosystem towards a common agenda. And the common agenda is the one that is defined by yourselves. Of course, worldwide, startups are faced with lots of challenges, as they've been highlighted, whether it's regulatory reforms, access to capital, the many impeding things that make it impossible for some of you to access markets, but at times, also a lack of collaboration amongst yourselves. And this is why the Startup 20, amongst the other things, said there's a need for us to try to harmonize digital trade frameworks and the regulatory platforms that we have in the African startup ecosystem. And that there's a need to make sure that we address the global gap that is found in terms of the access of financing through the establishment of the Startup Fund of Funds. Ne? It's Fund of Funds, yeah. And of course, introduce the global tax incentives to de-risk and channel catalytic capital to underserved regions and communities. Now, the process that kickstarts today, it's not kickstarting actually, it's the culmination of the work that has been done, begins to zoom into details of what is it that we think must be done. So I just highlighted on the mandate of the department, and of course to coordinate the entire ecosystem, we needed to come up with a strategy or a framework. And this is why we came up with the National Integrated Small Enterprise Development Framework, NISET. How many of you know about it? All right, okay. That's one. This is why last year, in the 6th administration, we pushed for the review of the National Small Enterprise Act. How many of you know about that? At least. This is why, after the act was signed, we also pushed for the development of the funding policy for startups and MSMEs of our country. How many of you know about the funding policy? All right, this is why now we are in the process of repealing the Businesses Act of 1991 and introducing the Business Licensing Bill that deals with certain clauses that we are repealing from the Businesses Act, but also taking into consideration that businesses get to be modernized. In 1991, there wasn't lots of utilization of artificial intelligence. There wasn't lots of digital transformation by companies. There wasn't a lot of platforms that were developed that we're utilizing for trade. So now we're giving effect to those in terms of the licensing. How many have participated in the consultations? Okay. Now I am seriously worried. You can't be members of a Startup Act organization and you don't engage with the legislation and policy. There's something wrong, very wrong, with that behavior, that you think it's gonna matter when it comes with you on the startup policy, but you're not participating on the ecosystem that will define the environment that you're working on. And this is the crisis that we face, especially in the tech sector. It's a crisis that we are facing. In my previous life, I had made sure that we had the chamber for small enterprises or startups, ICT. I had made sure that there's the drone council, so that all these different segments of technologies find expression and can begin to collaborate and speak with one voice in terms of interrogating the legislation. And if you are not doing that, none of this will be successful, I promise you, in this country. You'll be wasting your time sitting here and having the talks that are here. It's important that you take interest in that. Our own constitution in this country promotes active participation. That's why we never pass any policy without taking it to consultations, because we're giving the members of this country and those that are involved in that particular sector to make inputs so that the policy responds to the aspirations of the people of our country. Because it is not our policy as government. Right now, what it means is that as we're closing the inputs on the 20th and 28th, the startup grouping has not contributed the business licensing bill. The next thing will be coming up and saying there's this red tape. And we're giving you an opportunity to make inputs. If you go to the slide that was talking to the challenges, the survey that you conducted, again, there's the part, yes, that one with the, yeah. There's the part that talks to talent, skills, and employment, including visas. Again, we're identifying these things because we don't know what is happening in that space. Because if we know, which is why it helps to know what is in your environment so that you begin to challenge what is there if it's not working for you. I go everywhere and I get bashed everywhere. When are you reducing the red tape? And because I may not really learn it, and I will be like, okay, what is the red tape you're talking about? And then people want to think that, no, she's being silly. And like, I want to know. Because there's nothing like red tape, just red tape. Red tape is an outcome of something, whether it's the policy that is put in place or the regulation that is put in place or the law that prohibits you to do what you want to do or that defines other people that must come here and exclude you. And that's what you will say, a red tape. What they're going to say is lack of access to finances because of the laws and the regulations. Now, if you want to come and list all of this and yet you don't know a simple legislation that governs all of this, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? Policies relating to accessing capital, I asked about the funding policy that we designed. It tells that you have not given yourself time, even if you missed out on the consultations, but to interrogate what may be missing in that policy. And again, we do not only gazette in terms of publishing, we held stakeholder engagements, especially with others that were reaching out to say, we want to look at these challenges. I remember in the meeting that we had last year with Startup 20? Yeah. So they came and they raised these things and I asked, did you see this? Did you see this? Which were the legislations that we put. I said, go and read. So that you then reinforce what is already there instead of us coming with many pieces of policies and legislations that are repetitive or contradicting each other. But if we all participate in those, we'll be able to come up with policies that are responsive to all the sectors of the economy in our own country. Cross-border payments, IP commercialization, Minister Tau, Minister Blade Nzimande attending to that. There's work that you know very well. There's work that is ongoing. Vuiswa, you know very well, there's work that is ongoing there. And now, because I am me, I am going to say in your engagements, first read what exists and what does not exist, and then in what exists, what are the gaps? That's the only way you're gonna be able to come up with productive inputs to the startup policy that we are working on as the department. I said we had decided to use the Startup 20 grouping in order to galvanize lots of inputs, get consultations done as it was open to people to participate in the task forces so that we build from that. Use this opportunity to read. Did you see what are the outcomes of the 5 task teams of the SU20 that were handed over and we called TV? We're on social media and everywhere when we did that. You did not. Nevertheless, we have great news as the country. We've been taken out of grey listing. It's something to celebrate. That's promising on the economy. It means that our fiscal outlook has improved, and this is why I said the work that you are doing is very important on how our economy performs. But if you don't pay attention to what I spoke about, you are not going to make any impact. As we all know, the global economy remains volatile with many risks, but also opportunities associated with digital transformation, the artificial intelligence, but also the pressure to decarbonize and the disruptions in the global trade. I say this all the time as I started with the policy and legislation because I am a lawmaker. That's why I'm here, right? You also called me for that. That's why I started with that and taking it back to you because the law I make is for you. But as we embark on digital trade, it's also important to have an appreciation of the geopolitics that surround our environment because trade at all times is followed or driven by political interests. That's why you can't shy away from politics, and I don't want you to be politicians, there's many of us. But I would want you to engage because you are in the politics of business. I am in the business of politics. It's important that you understand the politics of business for you to be successful in business. That's why at all times we will say ideas are funded. The same way we advocate for funding for startups or the innovation, ideas that get to drive the political agenda of countries are funded. And if they're not funded by the right people, you will see chaos. But at the same time, when you see chaos, it is when innovators rise and provide solutions. So every disruption presents an opportunity to change how things are done. If you're not paying attention to that, if you don't understand why South Africa will take a particular stance against Ukraine with Russia, then you're going to miss it in what you want to do. You want to access other markets outside South Africa, the continent. You want to be global companies, which is what technology enables. But if you're not paying attention to the geopolitics, you're not going to be able to. Instead, you will continue being consumers of other people's innovations. And this is what we must fight against. I say this at all times, that in South Africa we always say we come from a very painful past. But there's one thing we're certain of. We're confident of the future because we are shaping the future. And those that handed over the baton, they laid the foundation politically. That's why you must participate in the development of the law. They fought for that right, so that the policies and legislations are not used to exclude you or capture yourself. Therefore, the creation of a more enabling policy and support ecosystem for startups is a no-brainer. It's critical that we do it, as we know that high-tech startups are engines of our economy. Also critical on the work that we'll be undertaking is paying attention to the ethics of the algorithms that are being used, because you're going to be embarking on global trade. Where are the software developers here? Prompt engineers? The disruptions that we're being, see software developers are in a crisis, developers are in a crisis right now. Have you begun to see the disruption that is being brought by prompt engineers? How do we balance those? How do we balance those with what we want to see in a policy? Because we shouldn't, because we do know here at home, a policy doesn't take less than a year because of that process of consultation, not because we are keeping it with us. But it stipulates that you take it out for gazetting people to make inputs. But even on the framework as we develop, you've got to have so many other meetings. And this is meant to enable that people participate. So it's important that you stay tuned to every change that happens in your own space. So that if you see that in the last 3 months, as we're in a process of developing this post, things have changed in terms of innovation. How do we quickly close the gap? Because once the policy is there, maybe we may have to go to a point of coming up with a legislation. It depends on the work that we will do. Other countries don't have the startup legislation. Others have, but they still have weak startup ecosystem. Others have the policies, but they're doing well. So we've got to make an assessment of what is it that we need based on the contributions and the assessment of the challenges, the risks and opportunities that we would want to see happening in our country. So it's important that you stay tuned. There's one magazine I like, I subscribe to, Quartz. How many of you? Yeah, it updates every day on what happens in the tech industry. Okay, if you may have others that are updating you. It's also wise, as you have the social media platforms, you custom make what content you want to consume to talk to your sector. Yes, you can have other things for social, but the ones that talk to your sector in the entire ecosystem, so that you stay informed, because what you are doing may be done by the other people, or other people may be doing what you're not doing, and then you can get an opportunity to get more information on how to improve. So as we use social media, because you are tech startups and that's your innovation, it's important that you also utilize those to respond to what you want to achieve as we seek to advance this policy that we're talking about. Because a policy must be able to address a mischief. But if you don't know the extent of the mischief, you are not going to achieve anything on the policy development. So engagements are very important. Reading and researching in the environment that we are in is important. I always say successful entrepreneurs are those that understand the problems that are faced by their people. And they provide the solution, and through the solution, they then get to make profit. Of course, here at home already you are attracting global venture capital, especially in the fintech, although there isn't much, which is why in the funding policy for MSMEs, we did advocate for that. Tax incentives, we spoke about the need to have the fund of funds, we spoke about the need to increase venture capital and also review the regulations around that space. Our funding policy talks to that, including the need to develop the movable collateral registry that must enable startups to be able to access financing. As I said, red tape is nothing but a regulation or a law. We are advocating for those. So we should be then doing an assessment of how best we can address those. Of course, on the movable collateral registry, we are working with the National Treasury and the World Bank in order how to shape it, and consultations have been held because it is the entrepreneurs at the center of what is being done. We are working closely with the Department of Science and Innovation, as I indicated. There are people who still say Department of Science, Technology and Innovation. Yeah. It's DSI. We changed that in 2019 in the administration when we changed the Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services to Communications and Digital Technologies. Then we left Science and Innovation with Department of Science. But I see everyone all the time, they make a mistake of going back to what it used to be, just like people still talk of SMMEs, whilst there's a law signed in this country that defines that we are MSMEs, including the definitions that we gave on thresholds. And this is important because you will be looking for opportunities at times or contracted by big business. How do you go about in terms of the rules? What are the expectations? What is it that you can get an incentive on? But if you don't understand the threshold that you belong to, according to the new definitions, then you may miss compliance or miss out on opportunities that you stand to benefit. And I did say, of course, the Department of Science and Innovation is looking into the IP laws, which it's important that we benchmark on those. How are other countries doing it? How are other continents doing it? So that we're able to develop laws that will enable us to be able to have a meaningful participation in the global space that we're talking about. I did say we are looking at issues of improving certain regulations in relation to the venture capital, especially making our country as a competitive destination for venture capitals. The flow is not really good, whether you look into the venture capital flow into the continent or here at home, there's a lot. And then the issue of the visa regime. Most of the time, people complain about the visas when they don't understand the relevant visas to apply for. There's more than 10 visa applications in this country, similarly to other countries that would have many. Businesses, when applying for business, or wanting to do business in other countries, they apply for business visa. And it's never difficult, as long as you have all the information that is required for your business. It doesn't take a lot. So the people that are referring to that, please unpack. Maybe there are things that you know about that we don't know about. Please try to unpack, again, that slide. Unpack what is it that is the problem about the visas in terms of enabling startups to be able to trade within the continent and worldwide. With the cross-border payments, I also agree. This is why the Africa Continental Free Trade Area has came up with the digital payment solution to address some of those issues. That's why in the Startup 20, again, it has advocated for the reforms in terms of financing across the countries to say, let's make sure that whatever, even if I want to protect my sovereignty, but that shouldn't be at the expense of the entrepreneurs being able to trade. That again is dealt with at level of the ministers of trade to enhance now for the global markets, not only for the continent. Do await, if you have missed out, because clearly you have, on the outcomes of the different engagement groups of the G20, which the leaders summit after Sunday will pronounce on to say this is what they would have resolved based on the recommendations. You can find this information online, what recommendations were made by the different working groups, the trade group, the finance group, Startup 20, and many others that affect your space. There's the digital one also, so that it helps. That's why the ministers of Home Affairs were also at the center to deal with the visa regime issues. Of course, it may be an issue of turnaround times on visa. As I said, you may be complaining about something. I don't know. That's why we said we are digitizing now the Home Affairs system in order to make sure that people can be able to access these services digitally without undermining the security and all the other things that are there. But colleagues, I want to say, please, please, give yourself time, read those that are there so that you're able to poke the gaps that are there so that as we develop this policy, we enhance those existing legislation and policies. We don't come with something that already exists because we don't know that it exists. We will have the policy, Phumzile. In our plans, we have planned for 2026. As I said, the foundational work has been done. So it's the consultations that we are waiting and the other work that you can bring on your side. And hopefully you will make submissions when we gazette the policy after the consultations that we would have participated on. Because once we have the framework, we can again have an engagement like this to take you through. We invite our team to take you through a webinar, take you through what is the framework now, and then I'm a comrade, your colleagues, you then make your inputs on the framework so that by the time we take it out, probably we minimize the lots of submissions or we just pick up on certain things that would have been excluded. Legislation in South Africa does not take less than 24 months. Usually it will be 24 to 36 months. Again, this is to give effect to the constitutional imperatives that we have. I know other people, they like, in other countries, if you can do this, no. Tina, we opted for a constitutional democracy that dictates that people must be given an opportunity to make inputs. At government level, we do it from the department, we take it to cabinet, cabinet approves, we take it to the public after cabinet approves, from the public we take it back to cabinet, from cabinet we take it to parliament, parliament does consultations publicly again. Because we've got to exhaust and make sure that the policy or the legislation, well, legislation that goes to parliament, the legislation receives sufficient consensus. Because that's the kind of democracy that we had adopted. So we're not going to be like, I know people are like, South Africa is not decisive. A minister or a prime minister in Botswana is able to wake up and say, this is not going to happen. Do you understand the environment you are operating in? Why is Stella not closing the foreign-owned spaza shops? There's a law in this country that is adopted, and everyone should abide by that. And if you have a problem with the law, you advocate for amendments when necessary without really undermining people's rights. Because the rights that each enjoys are enjoyed by everyone. But the rights that we enjoy come with their responsibilities. And the responsibility require you to know everything so that you can exercise your rights meaningfully. So we will take this, as I said, after the work that will be done. We are planning to take it indeed to cabinet. We would want to have this policy at least next year. That's our plan. If things go well, second quarter, latest third quarter of 2026, so that we can begin the work to champion the work and then change certain things, and startups are able to achieve what they want to achieve. I therefore look forward to working with all of you over the course of the next few months as we start putting flesh to this policy. Together, we will shape the South Africa of the future, the South Africa that we want, the Africa that we aspire. The one that is inclusive and where innovators and entrepreneurs drive growth. As I spoke about the ecosystem, you must also reach out to those that are responsible for infrastructure. It's important the balance on the services that you are providing as tech startups and also the digital infrastructure component, so that you don't come up with great innovations that would require people to be connected and they're not able to access your services because of poor digital infrastructure. Hence, I spoke of the ecosystem. And colleagues, I look forward to you bringing real solutions to the policy that we want to develop. Happy 10 years. And as I said, we are launching the first engagement on the Startup 20 framework produced by the SU20 grouping. Thank you so much. I would love to sit here with you. Let me apologize up front. Because we're hosting G20, then there's an engagement with Vietnam on the B2B, the business forum. So I have to rush. I know I'm speaking after 11 or quarter to 11, something like that. So I've got to rush and drive to that place. But I promise they will give me the inputs and will incorporate them if they make sense. I like emphasizing that with all due respect. Making sense means that if they're bringing something new to what we have. Thank you so much, and I wish you nothing but the best. Thank you.
Thank you to the Minister, Stella Ndabeni. A round of applause for that. We can just take a picture.
Can I, for the picture? I do hope that Melvin had shared the 4IR blueprint of the country, because I hear people coming up with solutions that are already detailed in that document. We detailed them years back, but people are talking about artificial intelligence as if it came yesterday.
Thank you, Minister. I think what stood out for me is that the Minister really challenged us, right? In as much as we are looking for answers, for solutions, for timeless things to happen, she also really challenged us as to what role are we playing in policy making. And I think that's quite important. And I think it also cements our role as Simudisa, as an organization that is able to garner inputs from ecosystems, as we've been doing for the past 10 years. But most importantly, oh, yes, yeah. Okay, perfect. So, Minister, I was just saying thank you for calling us to action, to also participate in the policy-making process, for us not to stand at the sidelines demanding for things to happen, but we are not taking our role in the policy-making process. You mentioned about 4 policy instruments that you're working with, so we have seen on the social pages, and we know based on the public calls for participation, how busy you are and how much you want us to participate in those policy instruments. Thank you for the efforts that you are also putting towards ensuring that there is regulatory environment for VC funding, which is one of our reforms as Simudisa and the SA Startup Act, but we are also excited that there is a need for us as an ecosystem player to bring you those insights from that data, where it is still a little bit fuzzy as to what are the entrepreneurs really needing. And so we will take you up on your offer to meet on a policy webinar or a further engagement like this with ecosystem members, as we have in the room in the first, second, or third quarter of 2026. I've noted all of them down. We will be in touch. Thank you. We will skip Dr. Chinton. We are waiting for him to join on the line. It is about 1 a.m. In Boston where he is, so we will skip over to the next slot on our agenda, and that is a case study on the SA Startup Act movement. How many of us have interacted with Simodisa and the SA Startup Act movement in the past 10 years? Quite a bit of us, but also not as much as it should. And so this session is really about unpacking what we have learned over the past 10 years, but also bringing in some of the data insights that we have picked up that informs the 3 policy reforms that we stand for as an organization. Mati Modise, Vice Chairperson of Simodisa, will be handling this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phumzile. We've been at this since 2014, so it's been a while. It's been more than 10 years. But Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, I think it's also good to reflect that our minister is very youthful. Our minister is very charismatic. Our minister is someone who listens, who reads the room, someone who keeps us, yes, keep doing that, somebody who keeps us accountable, and somebody that wants to ensure that South Africa and our startups, our high-impact, high-growth startups, succeed. So can we give our minister another hand of applause? We really, really value the time and also the recognition of ecosystem participants like ours. Before I start just giving an update, it's less of a case study, to be honest. It's more a conversation sharing the journey that we've traveled since 2014. There's a video that we made this in 2014. Phumzile, I don't know how to, if you could just help me play that video. But this is a video that would get us so inspired, remind us of why we are here and why we should keep ensuring that startups in South Africa succeed. So just give me a few minutes and watch this, and hopefully it does inspire you as well. So this is a very old video, as I said. It was made in 2014. This is when we started the journey of Simodisa. And Simodisa means to shepherd, to bring together, to usher. It's an acknowledgement that we are not doing this by ourselves. It's a collective. You know, around us are the startups and various other ecosystem players. Everybody has a role to play. So since 2014, when we started, and some of the figures would have been removed. I think I wouldn't mention names. And also, obviously, over time, we've been able to have other strategic partners like Allan, Gill, Philanthropy. But over the years, we've been committed to ensuring that we give South Africans an opportunity to shine. G20 for us is such a great platform to showcase who we are as high impact, high growth startups of South Africa. We have a role to play to build our economy, to create jobs. We have a role to play in the world. We find ourselves also having a role to play in the world. We're not just a small country. We're probably the furthest down south. When you have to travel from South Africa, we're the furthest down south. But we are a power engine of the continent. We are a power engine of the world. We've also been able to bring some of the greatest entrepreneurs of the world. So we see ourselves as part of the world. And Simodisa is proud. You know, I was part of the founding team. I joined Simodisa in 2015. And the people that created Simodisa were entrepreneurs that were outside of South Africa, but you know, building their technology companies, but realized that, well, charity begins at home. We are succeeding in Silicon Valley. We don't fit into Silicon Valley. We are proud South Africans. We want to share our ability, our capability. And we've identified why we had to leave South Africa to grow and scale our businesses. How do we play it back? So our chairman is a gentleman called Peter de Villiers, one of the key South African technology entrepreneurs. You probably didn't hear a lot about Peter de Villiers from Clickatel, but he's somebody's technology that really does enable a lot of the things we do on a daily basis. And these are the key people that are flying the flag. And when Peter came back from Silicon Valley in 2014, because he was living there for a good 10 years, he said, you know what? The policy environment in South Africa has to change. The policy environment has to be enabling. The policy environment has to say, Sipho from Soweto must also see himself as a technology entrepreneur, because it's not, I mean, Peter de Villiers is as Afrikaans as they come, but man who shares a vision for this country. It can't just be the Stellenbosch mafia that are the ones that have access to opportunities. Well, I said it, I know you guys think about it, but I said it. It's fine, we talk about this openly and freely because it is the South Africa we live in. And they said, how then do we put together a policy environment that's thriving? And that's when Simodisa started in 2014. We're able to come up with a white paper that was able to say, from a policy perspective, I mean, it was more than the items that were listed. And over time, it has gotten better because we've organized ourselves as a collective. The last thing government wants is too many noise and voices, right? We have to speak as one. We have to collaborate. We also have to see ourselves as part of the solution. We can't be sitting on the fence and pointing fingers and throwing stones, because this is a country we are co-building. It's not government's responsibility alone. There has to be a level of, it is our country that we have to build, right? So you saw that it was, you know, by 2020. Now it's 2025, right? Now it's 2025, and there are a number of jobs that are needed. I think the most disheartening thing for me as a South African is to wake up in the morning and walk around and just see how many young people that are smart, that are capable, that are full of energy and also have a vision, but we are not necessarily able to give them that enabling environment. But it's a collective challenge, a collective opportunity. And I did, Phumzile did prepare some slides, so let me not segue too much from that. But Minister, by all means, if you need to leave, feel free to do it. I'll just continue on just sharing the Simodis. But let's give the Minister another shot.
My apologies, I know I've taken my time. Earlier on, I spoke about the ethics of algorithms. I saw the video, and then I was looking at the people that are recognized on the innovations. And there are people that are not mentioned here in South Africa that have great innovations. I think we must start there. Recognize our innovators and elevate them to that level. So as I was talking about the ethics, I just decided to go and ask who's the founder of Please Call Me. And guess what AI told me? They didn't mention the real person. And this is the reality. This is the reality that you will go through if you're not paying attention to the algorithms. So the people that are programming must really pay attention to that, because whatever that you're doing here can then be taken over by other people in whatever language that they would want to use. Thank you so much.
I agree with the Minister. Wonderful. So yes, we are the golden thread of the ecosystem, because we understand that there's multiple players and everybody has to identify themselves and see themselves as part of an ecosystem. Because the other challenge is there are a lot of people that want to come into an ecosystem and dominate, right? And be the authorities. Simodisa is not that. We are the golden thread. Simodisa acknowledges everybody's role and responsibility. And how do we bring ourselves together as a collective so that we can have collective inputs, collective and shared visions for our startups in South Africa. So even if you've never known of Simodisa, Simodisa is a home for you. If you're representing an accelerator, incubator, if you're mentoring small businesses in our country, you have a role to play. We want to work with you. On an annual basis, we have a steering committee of the Startup Act movement. So we call it movement because, you know, as much as we're not political, there is politics to what we're doing. And also you have to see yourself as driving a movement. So we call it the Startup Act movement. Oh, okay. We call it the Startup Act movement, and in essence, on an annual basis, there's a rotation of the ecosystem players that sit on our committee. And we always have a call for people, if they want to sit on the committee for a year and contribute and share your learned inputs and insights, and tell us who you are and what you're doing in the ecosystem. So it's an open society. It's an open environment where we invite you all to be part of Simodisa. I just need my next slide, please. Thank you. And yes, in terms of, I love the minister's reflection, an honest reflection, but she was also tasking us and saying, but do you know about? Did you contribute towards? Are you aware of? Right? I liked the fact that she kept us accountable. Before we say that this is a problem, we have to have looked at what do we have in place, what are the gaps, and what can government do? So I'm quite encouraged that we have a ministry that's actually also bottom up, which is quite dynamic, because in the past, a lot of the engagements have been top down. Everybody just needs to suck it up and take it in. But now we have a ministry that's committed, that listens and wants to ensure that we are doing things that are fit for purpose, right? What's the point of writing a policy if it's not fit for purpose? What's the point of having a policy that you cannot relate to? And Phumzile did mention earlier on that, you know, the word startup is quite open-ended, right? Startup is I wake up, I have an idea, and I start a business, right? But the kind of startups that we represent, these are startups that are high impact, high growth. These are startups that do invest in a lot of research and development. These are startups that are earning, well, I mean, they want to scale their businesses. So intellectual property is very, very important. The protection of the intellectual property is very, very important. The ability to scale and grow their businesses is very, very important. But also the ability to finance that scale is very, very important. So these are startups that are also contributing towards our economy, that are contributing towards the tax base. So they're very dynamic. And in the past, there hasn't been anything within policy that speaks to nurturing those startups. So it's very encouraging that next year we will have a policy that speaks to startups, that speaks to funding startups, that speaks to intellectual property. And for that to happen, we will need for the different ministries to work together, which has been the case. right? Simodisa has been a convener of the various ministries. It's not just the Department of Small Business Development. It's not just the Department of Science and Innovation. It's not DSTI, it's DSI. It's not just the Department of Trade and Industry. There is a multitude of government entities that have come together and have identified their role. But it's important that these startups have an incentive. So I think one of the key policies that we've been able to advocate and lobby for, it's tax breaks, tax incentives. Make it easy for businesses to grow. Don't strangle them and stifle them before they even reach, certain, don't kill them before they even grow, right? And I think our ministry understands that, and I think our minister was able to say, I get you, I've heard you, and we are going to make it work because we have listened. Things such as barriers, access to talent, right? I made reference earlier on around capable, talented South Africans that are walking around despondent. It's nice for us to be here sitting in Sandton, having a great conversation about a great policy environment, but for the most of South Africans, they don't see themselves in this success, right? How are we going to nurture the talent that is going to build our economy? How are we going to make sure that our young people are capable, are competent, are educated, because the level of our education is also on point, right? I read yesterday that Rwanda, I think it's Rwanda, yes, young people, by the time they leave school, will have the skills of AI, right? It's not just a segue, a theme, a topic. It is a reality. I'm sure most of you, I would ask the question, who in this room doesn't use AI? I think everybody uses AI, right? You're forced to use AI. You're forced to understand. It's changed it's such a dynamic thing. And so skills that are relevant to South Africa and South Africa's needs and South Africa's economical needs are very, very important. And then exchange control limitations, that is also a very unique policy environment, which Simodisa has been tackling for years. I have Shelley, who will speak to this earlier, in the next panel. And Shelley is one of those people that when I saw this morning, I was so happy and excited to see her. Shelley, please just wave your hand. And Shelley has been one of, when we started Simodisa around 2014, 2015, she was there, right? She represented SAFCA, and her job at SAFCA, which is the Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, is to lobby government around ensuring that for investors like venture capitalists and private equity, it's easy for them to invest in ventures and businesses, right? And exchange control was one of the challenges. So over the years, we've had to engage Treasury around how do you reduce that red tape. Exchange control is something that a few countries have exchange control. It's a bit of a legacy policy that's been in place before 1994, and it's still here. So exchange control makes it very difficult for investors to invest in South African businesses. They would rather look at a company that's registered in Mauritius or in the United Kingdom or in Delaware in America before they touch a South African startup because of exchange control. It's an added layer of bureaucracy. It makes it difficult to exchange intellectual property, and it's something that's very unique to South African entrepreneurs. So in a world that has limited capital, right? In a world that has capital that doesn't want to look at Africa, but it must look at Africa because it's a growing frontier, the last thing you want is for them to now be, it's difficult for them to invest in us. So exchange control, chances are it will not be removed. That's kind of the feedback that we've had, but they are doing amendments that will make it easier. If you want more information around exchange control and the challenges that it brings and the bureaucracy, you're more than welcome to read about it. It's on our website. We speak about it a lot. But these are some of the policy environments that we've been lobbying government, and we have been very successful. To date, we've been engaging Treasury. I think in 2020 when we started the Startup Act movement, because before it was just Simodisa interacting with the ecosystem. But in 2020, we said, well, there's countries like Tunisia, there's countries like Nigeria that are now coming up with startup acts, startup bills. They're passing that. A lot of investments are going into those jurisdictions, right? Nigerian startups, you hear of Flutterware and these big unicorns that are coming out of Africa. where are the South African unicorns? They're coming, but let's make it easier for them to happen. And things such as exchange control is a challenge, because for them to grow and scale and be billion-dollar valued businesses, things such as exchange control will make it very difficult on their journeys. Inhibiting regulatory barriers that hamper globalization and investments into qualifying startups. Exchange control is one of those. So there has been progress, alas, there has been progress. There's a great ecosystem that wants startups to win, that wants startups to thrive in South Africa, and we've had a lot of research as well. I think as much as it's probably the boring part of what we do, but if you're an intellectual, you probably find it very exciting to really look into and read into, what is the policy environment. And I think the minister spoke well towards why it is important for you to understand the policy environment in which you're working within, because you will one day be a big business. You're not going to be a small business forever. You will one day be a big business that has to deal with exchange control. One day you'll want to scale your business outside of the borders of South Africa. You don't want to find out about that when you're now scaling. You want to know about it now when you're starting, right? So that is the big part of the work that we're doing around know about the policy environment now, not later on when now you have to pay a lot of legal fees because we're not focusing on the policy environment around you. We also have a startup policy library, making it very easy for you to have a sense of what is a policy that is out there in South Africa as a startup. So we do have a policy library. It's on our website, I think, Pumzile. It's on our website, and it does give you sectorially what governs you as a small business that's going to grow and scale and be a discovery, a momentum of tomorrow. So we've made it easy for you to understand the policy that Minister was talking about. And then policy dialogues and thought leadership. It's featuring the great entrepreneurs of our country. And I do apologize that that video is quite late, but when we do update it, it's going to feature the great entrepreneurs of now, right? It's not going to have Elon Musk, that's for sure. That much I can promise you. It's going to have great entrepreneurs, the Melvin Lubegas of this country, the Yokos of this country, and we have a very good relationship with high-impact, high-growth startups in this country. And then startup policy where South Africa has competitive strengths. It's also good to kind of say, okay, fine, we have messed up and we haven't been able to do certain things, right? But pat yourself on the back, right? Our intellectual property regime in South Africa, it's quite strong, right? It's quite advanced, and it's good to see some of our departments being here because they're the ones that focus on intellectual property rights of South Africa. Strong, developed systems, better than many African counterparts, which it's a good thing. I think collectively we need to work with our African counterparts, but it's also good to say, well, we're quite progressive as South Africa when it comes to IP. DFI ecosystem, so we do have a lot of funding. I'm skeptical of saying this because the small businesses will be like, where's the money, right? When you say, okay, there's lots of money in South Africa, it's like, show me, where's the money? Which is true, right? But we do have government that have like the IDC, TIA, SIDA, SA, SMME fund. Our responsibility as Simodisa is how do you access that funding? How do you become investment ready? Because the thing is, early stage investments are the ones that are going to fuel startups of our future and startups of South Africa. So the venture capital industry has to be strong, right? Because if you start a business, you go to the bank, they will not say yes. Unless you have been around long enough, you've got scale, you have great financials, your ability to show that your business has traction. So there are a couple of things that you have to put in place before anyone can entrust you with their finance. Our responsibility as Simodisa is to introduce you to what's available, but to also ensure that you are investment ready. So important. Financial literacy in South Africa is something that's not great. So when it's time for you to produce your financials, and anybody who's now having to make a decision to fund you based on your financials, we need to make sure that you know your numbers. Numbers are very, very important. And as entrepreneurs, you're expected to wear all the hats, especially initially before you can hire a CFO. But that's later on. But in the early stages, when you're starting, you didn't study accounting, you didn't do finance, it's our responsibility to also share templates of what a good pitching deck looks like, or what a good business plan looks like, and who are the people that will be looking at that. So this is some of the things we do have as Simodisa, right? It's an open door policy where you come in and say, I'm an entrepreneur, I need this. We'll be able to guide you. Besides the library that we have around policy, it's also having templates of how can we make sure that you succeed. And then research and development, it's quite strong in South Africa. It's more generous than Brazil, but lacks Chile, Singapore style early stage focus. I think Chile and Singapore are also the poster childs of progressive ecosystems globally when it comes to really supporting entrepreneurial growth and development. But we are there. You know, as South Africans, we are there. We can punch above the belt, and there is a great story to be told. Consider how much time do I have? Because I could talk the whole day. Okay, and then summary of key constraints holding back global startup growth. So the reason why we put the word global is because we want you to go beyond South Africa, because you can. You know, when people in other jurisdictions start their businesses, they don't start to just sell in their community. They start so that they can grow globally. So that's the kind of mentality and mindset that, of course, if it's your ambition, I mean, if it's not and you want to trade locally, there's also nothing wrong with that. But we do need more South Africans that are highly talented to fly the South African flag, so that they can showcase the talent that we have and our ability to be entrepreneurial. There are great examples. One just walked in, Melvin Lubega. He's going to be on one of the panels later on. But there are great examples of great South African entrepreneurs. So how do we make sure that that word global startup growth is very important? Because at Simodisa, it's about going beyond. It's about scaling your business and going beyond the borders. So some of the challenges which I'm sure we've spoken about ad nauseum, including exchange control, no startup visa, tax and regulation burdens, fragmented DFI support ecosystem, lack of inclusive policy tools for women and marginalized founders is also very important. Today's a very important day around gender. It's a gender lens today, right? So it's important that inclusivity is key, right? That people in communities where I grew up was in the Free State, right? In Putadichawa, which is like a township. Young people from my township need to see themselves as global entrepreneurs and global startups. So how, as much as we are talking about high impact, high growth startups, someone in a township environment needs to understand what it is to be an international startup, because they have examples. Luckily, we do have great examples in South Africa, but there has to be a lot of grassroots interventions so that young people can see themselves as international entrepreneurs. Poor international visibility and investor engagement. Sure, we can always have better PR as South Africa. I think we brought up in a way where we must be humble and you must be, don't talk too much about yourself. But then when you are there interacting with Nigerian entrepreneurs, they are bold, right? That's why a lot of funding is channeled there. They have like a startup bill that they've put in place. So they are bold, and South Africa has a great story to share, but we shouldn't be shy to share it. We shouldn't be shy to shine. We have what it takes. We're already doing it. So we need to be advocating and lobbying and showcasing great examples and great stories of South African entrepreneurs. Policy recommendations, access to global markets, also important. Simplify startup registration, the red tape. I think that's quite key, but over the years, we've gotten better as well. I think we must give credit to the CIPC, sorry, I'm a bit dyslexic, CIPC, they've done well over the years. So it's becoming easier. I mean, if you want to open a business, you can do it within 2 days at most. It's possible. You'll have your BEE and all your compliance documentation, tax and everything within 2 days. So we've done better in that regard. Create global soft landing hubs, fintech in London, AI in Berlin. Well, there's that, but I think how do we profile some of the hubs we have, right? There's Simologong just down the road here in Johannesburg. It focuses on the creative industry. It's attached to Wits University. So how do we profile what we have? There's Silicon Cape. In Cape, there's Westgrow. How do we profile what exists in our ecosystems? There's the Innovation Hub that exists there in Pretoria. So how do we profile what we have, and how do we create accessibility? It's there. So we need to profile more and we need to profile better because they do exist. Established SA startup scale hubs for export readiness and coordination, very, very important to understand if you're going to be scaling globally, this is a framework for it. It's not an easy thing, but we need to kind of make it bite-sized so that you understand it. There are incentives from a lot of our departments, but most of the times we don't know about them. That you can, if you wanted to showcase your products, your services, there are trade shows that the government does subsidize, right? They'll pay for you. Sometimes you have to pay up front and then they reimburse you, but there are those kind of subsidies that exist. How do we profile what exists in our country? Because it's a lot. Leverage trade associations for export entry support, build diaspora-driven export platforms like She Trade ZA? What? Okay. So there's great platforms such as that exist. But if you had to ask me who in this room knew about that I didn't know about it until now, actually. Let me be honest. So there's a lot that does exist, and how do we profile and how do we showcase that? Launch public-private export cluster within market presence, and then develop embassy startup desks and diplomatic export pathways. I think it's great. South Africa is doing a lot of that. We work with a lot of countries like Sweden, like Ireland, but our entrepreneurs need to know about these opportunities, right? So Simodisa does its level best. We will do better and we will do more in showcasing what is out there at your disposal. So beyond just the policy work that we're doing, the policy library, the lobbying and advocacy, I think there is an awareness part around what exists in South Africa. So I think this is the last slide. Policy recommendation, access to foreign capital, introduce safe harbor exchange control exemptions. We've spoken about that. Launch a dedicated startup visa for global founders and investors. We've spoken about where things are. It is progressing, actually. I think next year there will be an announcement. And this is something when 2020 we did the Startup Act and we did a review of really what's missing. It was non-existent until we had a conversation with the president and he's like, okay, I hear you guys. Because yes, there are different visa categories, but there's no one that speaks to being, that speaks to wanting to start a business. And a lot of the times, like the business visa is expensive. You have to invest a lot of money. You have to use a lot of, spend a lot of money in legal fees in setting this up, but also investing physically before you could be regarded as a business. You're now competing with the Nestle's that are wanting to be in South Africa or are in South Africa. So there's nothing that speaks to those who still are small enough but want to expand in South Africa. So that's what the regime is about. 4 or 5 years ago, there was nothing really happening, but over time, the business visa, well, the startup visa is something that is going to probably be introduced next year or announced. Simplify and extend R&D tax credits to pre-revenue startups. So we want to give you incentives, right? We also acknowledge that pre-revenue, you're still early in stage enough. You haven't made enough money, but let's give you those incentives. Reinstate, modernize Section 12J. Shelley, this is your favorite one. It's an interesting tax incentive that I think in 2020 the government reviewed and said, we will not give a tax incentive to those who are investing in startups. That for us was a blow. Yes, a lady in the audience is saying it was a mess when they stopped it. But reinstating it in a different form, which is more controlled, which shows value, because people were also abusing it, let's also be honest. People were investing things besides investing in startups for venture capital. So reinstating a tax incentive for those who want to invest in early stage businesses is something that South Africa is looking at and should be hopefully reinstating. It might come in a different form that is more bulletproof and not open to abuse, so that it is successful and it's fit for purpose. Legalize safe notes and convertible debt in SA investment law. Pool public-private funds into blended early-stage investments. So the ability for public and private capital to work together is important, right? Because we said that we have quite a strong DFI presence in our country, right? So the IDCs. But how does that now come with the VC industry? And how is it a blended finance mechanism? Important, because then it's a shared risk, shared opportunity. So we need to do more of that. And then create embassy-led global VC matchmaking programs. I think those do exist, but we need to highlight them more and encourage more to happen. And then last slide, strategic engagement roadmap towards startup success. So it speaks to the different ministries that we have been working with. And they're all wanting to make sure that small businesses do thrive, right? So we have the National Treasury. They focus a lot on the exchange control policy-related matters. They're kind of warming up. It was very, very difficult to speak to Treasury, but they have warmed up over the years, and we have had some traction. And we, like, you know, when the minister was here, I was not trying to gain brownie points by saying, let's work together, let's not throw stones, but it's true, right? You have to be part of the solution, right? We have to be accountable as startups and in startup ecosystems, and let's work with government, right? We have the National Treasury, we have the DSI, we have the DSBD, and also the DTIC when it comes to trade and industry now. So there's a lot of work to be done. As South Africa, we have a big role to play, not just for South Africans, but for the world. And that's basically what's been happening, the B20, the S20, and also the G20, right? A lot needs to be done. Everyone in this room, when you go out of this room, just say, what can I do over and above what I do for my own business and my own intentions for the country? Firstly, join the movement. We call it a movement because it's not a political party, but we're passionate about acknowledging the role of startups in the country. Secondly, ensure that when you are wanting to grow and scale your business, understand your business, understand the numbers, understand the policy environment in your business, right? I know it's difficult because you want to make money, you waking up, you employing people, you have to pay salaries. Next week is probably, you don't even want to think about next week because this is like payday, everyone needs to get paid. So what I'm asking of you is quite a lot, but we have to act as a community because that's the only way we're going to see the traction in our country. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to where the story started, the role of Simodisa. It's important that we had government here to interact and engage and share their story. And let's rally behind the ministry to have a strong startup policy, and let's support it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matsi, for sharing some of the highlights of our journey, but a lot of them were challenges, right? You can imagine starting a vision from what some of the best practices are being done in Silicon Valley and coming into the big land of South Africa and needing to engage with an ever-changing government and wanting to really create positive change. It hasn't been an easy feat, but we are so excited that some of the things that we started thinking about 10 years ago in terms of the exchange controls and tax visas, tax incentives and the startup visas are really starting to see light in what the minister spoke about. And so we're really excited that throughout the journey of Simodisa, we're starting to see our work really starting to see to bear fruit. We're about to change gears. We will be leading a panel discussion now with a couple of experts from the globe, in fact, because this is a G20 conversation, right? So what is happening in other parts of the world that we can feed in and integrate into this new startup policy? A lot of the information that we've been sharing since the morning, we will be feeding into the policy brief that we're going to be inputting into the small business department. So please do feel free to also give us your inputs on email. My email address is going to be shown at the end of this presentation when we finish, so that anything else that you might have thought of that we didn't cover in any of the sessions or the breakaways, you can also supplement so that we can really have an ecosystem created input into the department as they design this policy. The panel discussion is going to be led by Shaylee Lotz, who is a good friend of the Startup Act movement. She's a steering committee member of ours and is a private investment practitioner, was previously at SAVCA, as Mati mentioned earlier on, and she is now a partner at Horizon Equity. Shaylee, please join us in leading this exciting panel.
Great start with the technology. Okay, that's much better. Good morning, and thanks so much for joining us. I won't take it personally that a couple of people in the room left as we got up to talk, but ideally they just went for a comfort break and they'll be back soon. So this morning I'm actually really excited because for the first time we've almost moved from talking about policy to actually being able to co-create it. And I know a lot gets spoken about co-creating policy. And listening to the minister talk this morning, it just struck me that actually, in a lot of instances, when people talk about policy, it's up here. When you talk to the startups or the entrepreneurs themselves, they're like, but I don't understand how that relates to my day job, right? I have to go and comply with SARS, and every 2 months I have to do a VAT return, and I have to fight with the bank because they won't let me remit money overseas. I don't see where in the policy it says you cannot remit money overseas unless you have these 10 documents and then the bank's still going to say no. And I think that's where the mismatch often sits, is because you're not going to find a policy that says you cannot do this. And finding a gap is very difficult from an entrepreneur perspective. And I've sat in a lot of policy engagements where the policymakers and the regulators have said, well, where are the entrepreneurs in the room and where are the startups? And the honest answer is, you're actually doing your day job and you are trying to survive. And to take a day out to go and sit with National Treasury or in a tax reform to work out where your incentive sits and why you can't get access to it, it doesn't often feature in your day job. So I think I'm really excited with this multi-stakeholder panel I have sitting here. And actually, I'm just here to ask them a couple of questions and warm them up a bit, and actually to just transfer over to you and to give you the opportunity to ask them questions. Because I think, if nothing else, when we walk away from today, if we can try and understand how we can make everybody's life easier and how we can meet in the middle to create something that actually works for everybody. The policymakers can understand where you're coming from, and actually it's going to make your day job easier to access capital, and easier to grow and scale your business. So without further ado, I will ask each of them to do an introduction of each of the panelists before I fly into my questions. So I'll start with the first person to my left is the Honourable Dr. Lavina Ramikissoon. I hope I got that one right. From the African Union. So we'll start there.
Yeah, thanks so much. So almost right. But we'll give it to you. So I'm the ambassador for the African Union. My portfolio is looking after the Science, Technology, Research, Innovation Council, which I sit and co-chair. Another portfolio hat that I have is looking after the African diasporan community. So innovation and diasporan is definitely part and parcel of the larger narrative. If anyone knows, I've been in the technology space because I come from that, and I'm fondly known as the AI mom. So I've had my first AI startup way back. It was one of the first ones ever created for South Africa, probably about a good 17 years ago, giving away my age, but yeah, sure.
And then on to Melvin Lebega. And he really sits with two hats as really an entrepreneur that has scaled a significant business. And now he's switched to what would some call the dark side and is now an investor and actually uses his experience as being an entrepreneur to work out which entities to fund.
No, thank you very much. And pleasure to be here. It's so important to have these conversations and also have them in a very frank and direct way. And I like the tone being set by the minister about having frank conversations. As mentioned, I'm on the dark side now. Marvin Lebega was a tech entrepreneur for over a decade, building companies across 60 markets, teams in about 22. Over the last 4 years, been active as an investor in early stage startups across Europe and Africa. And I guess a third hat that I'm sometimes wear when I wear a suit and tie is the president appointed me to lead the transformation of government services across the country, and so doing some work on that.
Thanks, Melvin. And then I'm on to Nadia Moussaji, and she's part of the B20 Digital Transformation Task Force. So maybe do a little introduction and tell us about the task force.
I'm sure. Hi. So I just wear one hat, which is part of the Digital Transformation Task Force, but I'm an engineer, entrepreneur, investor, and if I could choose a title, it would be Chief Tinkering Officer. A serial entrepreneur. So I guess my claim to fame is being the co-founder at WIMHub. WIMHub is an ecosystem builder that has supported women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mining, manufacturing for almost 2 decades, and worked in 33 countries around the world to support building female engineering and tech talent, supporting female founders in STEM businesses, building innovation spaces. We've got 3 hubs in Cape Town, Joburg, and East London in partnership with Cisco. And then we've got a VC fund, one of the first female gender lens funds on the African continent, called 535 Ventures. And we are rethinking the way we deploy capital. And then the reason why I was on B20 was because I'm obsessed with AI and cybersecurity, and I have a cybersecurity startup called CyberFence that uses AI to look at your digital footprint and tell you how vulnerable you are to cyber threats. So very serial, very entrepreneurial, and very passionate about this country.
Thank you. And last but obviously not least, Sanjay Soni, and he's part of the SA Startup Act, and he's been helping with the policy side of things, so he can help bridge the gap in terms of what the minister said and what everybody else sees in terms of their day job.
I'm going to say very little. Entrepreneur, tech exeter, entrepreneur. Just a bit of background to myself. I sit actually on both sides of the table. I'm also on the dark side. I'm an angel investor. I'm part of a group called Josie Angels. We invest in earlier stage tech startups. And outside of investing, I also work with entrepreneurs. I'm part of the warm-up program on a couple of their programs, mentor entrepreneurs, basically trying to help entrepreneurs get forward in terms of their business. And lastly, I've been part of the SA Startup Act movement now 2 years.
Thank you. See, I wasn't kidding. It really is a great panel. Okay, so Sanjay, I'm going to start with you. And really, when we talk about the Startup Act and it's proposed a definition, okay, of what qualifies as a high-growth startup or innovation-driven startup, why is getting the definition so right, and why do we care about trying to define something so specific?
Shelly, thanks for that. So I guess upfront, I must confess, trying to see if officials from the department are here. I've had access to a copy of the current version of the draft policy. So in thinking about this question, I've had basically 2 lenses through which to look at it. Number one, at the moment, what has the department put forward? And secondly, being involved in the ecosystem, what can be enhanced given what's currently on the table? So those are the 2 lenses that I've looked at. Before I get into that, I came across a piece of research done earlier this week. They looked at 7,000 respondents across 26 countries to assess entrepreneurial mindset. South Africa came number 1. And I'm starting with that by saying, as a country, as a nation, we are a bunch of entrepreneurs. I think the pieces that are missing is, do we have policy that allow entrepreneurs to grow global businesses? And the minister spoke a bit about that. Plans are Q2, Q3 next year to put in place the policy. Just perhaps to talk about the challenge that we're trying to solve before I can give some thoughts around the definition itself. So I think it's important to understand the context of the challenge. I mean, we've spoken a lot about this in terms of the regulation, in terms of exchange controls, access to finance, market access, governance, so on, so on. I guess the one key thing is we've got to distinguish startups from MSMEs. And this is a startup policy, because I do believe these are 2 different segments of entrepreneurs that need to be treated differently. So in terms of us thinking about a clear definition, I'm just going to give some suggestions for not only ourselves, but for the department as well. I guess the first thing is in terms of targeting. In terms of the policy, it unfortunately can't reach everybody, right? So I guess from a targeting perspective, it needs to have a clear definition that prioritizes truly high growth startups, and I guess doesn't start to focus on MSMEs. So I guess that's the first thing. at the point that the policy is in place, it becomes an entry ticket in terms of benefits that can exist in the marketplace. Whether it's tax, whether it's exchange controls, we spoke about visas, R&D support, procurement preferences. In terms of the third thing, our definition needs to be an SA term that actually lives with us, given the context of South Africa. I guess the great thing is, as a country, we are actually unique. And the definition that we put in place has to talk to South African founders and entrepreneurs that fits the bill. Also linking into the definition is it's got to cater for an opportunity to expand, both locally as well as globally. We've got to incorporate an element of measurement and accountability, where we start to separate high-growth startups from the broader MSME base so that we can track jobs, investment, exports, and IP. And I want to close with this line. The ultimate definition of startup in our context is the API between government and founders. It tells the system who to serve. It tells the system who to serve, and in terms of the instruments that it needs to serve it with. Thanks, Shirley.
I think what's interesting with that is that in a place where we have limited resources, it's really key to define who gets what resources and how you differentiate. Because I think the difficult part that the DSBD has is that in reality, all MSMEs are very different, right? So they are now everything to everyone. And I think this definition is actually key in terms of trying to work that out. So thank you, Sanjay. And then on to you, Nadia. So you work in the digital trade portfolio. What are the key digital trade rules that you think South Africa has to get right in order to help the startups trade globally? And I think it's really important for the people in this room because that's what they're looking to do, right?
Yeah, and I think green light is on. There we go. No, there we go. It was just there we go. Thanks, guys. Everybody's going to tell you about money because cross-border payments and moving money is a pain in the ass. Let's be honest. But what we're not going to talk about, and I think we need to, is to talk about data because data is the new gold. And when we think about how we protect data, use data to train models, and I saw this definition once, which I absolutely love. If you're not paying for the app, then you're the product, right? And your data is being used. And what's going to happen is that governments, and we've seen this in Germany, where they, big tech companies are not allowed to use German data to train models. We've got the POPIA Act, which stops and tries to protect user data. And so I think when we think about digital trade, and especially for startups that are in the currency of exchanging data and using that to create great products and services, I think that's going to be a big stumbling block. And I think when we talk about 24 months to be able to move policy across the line, I can tell you now that who vibe codes, builds apps without coding, yeah, okay, right? That happened in February. Vibe coding started in February, which is basically your ability to be able to tell an app how to, you basically no longer need to learn how to code because coding is just like language. It's like learning Spanish. Now you don't have to learn Spanish. Now you can tell the AI in English and then it will code for you because it can speak computer, right? So vibe coding came out in February, right? Now we're using data to be able to do that and the training data. So in 24 months' time, the world would have completely shifted in this space. And so government will then regulate backwards. And it may actually, so now you're a data-driven startup and you're selling data and you're selling coding and vibe coding, and then government regulates you 2 years down the line and there goes your startup. Right, and you aren't able to scale because now they've like cramped down on the movement of data outside of a country and who can train it and who can't. And then it starts to impact data centers, for example, where information is moving in and out of a country. And so when you start to regulate that, companies are reluctant to put centers somewhere where there is going to be a shutdown on terms of data and kind of data sovereignty. So the regulation is going to take 2 years, and by that time, it may kill the businesses that are like at hyperscaling.
Thank you. I'll pass that on to Melvin, and that can be my first question. As an investor, how do you, I guess, foresee it, or how do you consider who will get funding and who won't, and then taking the regulations that potentially could be changing over time into consideration?
It's such an important consideration. So just for context, we invest across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We have about 150 companies in our portfolio, from seed through to unicorns. And the reality is, as an investor, even if you have an Africa mandate, you aren't forced to invest in South Africa. And so you have to realize there's a global competition for capital as well, which often we forget. It's not as if because I am a black SMME in Joburg, I must get the money. Investors don't care about that. And so often when you think about it, policy plays a big role in attracting that capital. Because at the outset, yes, we all look for entrepreneurs solving real problems and are able to actually get their businesses going. But if you are not able to, for example, register for a payment gateway or start a company, you always question whether you can actually find a big pool of, let's call it, entrepreneurs to actually back in an ecosystem. I think in South Africa for a long time, I would almost argue that for many years in past history, South Africa was a very leading country in terms of startup financing, whereas recently what you're seeing is Nigeria and Kenya and even Egypt these days overtaking us. And we're very entrepreneurial, and I think that's something which is very key. But in the same vein, if you look at an entrepreneurial team, you back a founder on their ability to hire quality talent and to retain them. And so if you can't incentivize a founder, yes, let's say visas are sorted out. You can't give them stock options because the tax regime is so complex to navigate that. All of a sudden, it's the stuff that you aren't talking about that's so important, because ultimately, whilst everyone's mission-driven, an employee also wants to get paid. And so you can't discount the fact that it's bread and butter issues. And so often we can, yes, talk about a visa, someone comes to the country, but if they can't even register their stock options in the country, it's a bigger issue. I think for us as an investor, and I think it's the point you raised, Nadia, around just having certainty. If you invest in a company, so let's say it's a VC investor, it's a 10-year lifespan, you invest in a company over 5 years and you want to exit the asset. If you can't expect some level of certainty over that 5 to 10-year horizon, how are you going to have the comfort to invest meaningful capital into an ecosystem? And so whilst these are all obvious things, they often tie back to policy. And I think that's where the difference comes in.
Thank you. And I think the interesting part that comes across, Melvin, is that actually when you ask the VCs, what do they need? Because they struggle to raise capital. So if they're struggling to raise capital themselves, there's less capital to go into the underlying startups. And the unanimous response that I actually got was, we actually need a thriving startup community and we need to be able to exit. So as in, they are only going to hold those entities for 5 years and then they're going to exit. And if you are not able to exit, you can't prove to your investors that you can actually do this and therefore raise more capital. So I'm wondering about the exit, environment that you've actually seen, Melvin, and is there any regulation there that you think that we can do, or policy that will support that?
The reality is, often it's said in circles that the last country incorporated in Africa was Delaware, because many startups seem to choose Delaware as an incorporation. And so for me, that's actually the biggest concern, where companies aren't even choosing to incorporate on their own continent. So therefore, it creates other issues around tax and future things. But the reality is, exchange control matters when it comes down to exits as well. Because when a company is, for example, I was in Saudi a few weeks ago, and they were looking at Africa, and they were saying, okay, fine, which geography should we look at? But everyone's saying, fine, are you a Mauritius company versus are you a South African company? It's almost like where you're domiciled actually impacts your ability to exit, which is unfortunate, because if you have, we began our business. I remember we had, like, let's say, $1 million of revenue before we raised some money. And everyone's like, but you are a South African company, like, we can't really exit that, how does it work? And we actually ended up becoming a Delaware company because we had to go through this program called Y Combinator. And so instinctively, the geography you're in affects your ability to exit, and your exit opportunities, because everyone knows when you're trying to sell something, the bigger the people, more people you can sell to, the higher the price you'll get. And so that's so integral, exits plus the economy you find yourselves in.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to move over to the Honourable Ambassador. And the reality is that the continent is doing some things right. I think we need to accept that. So I'm hoping that you can actually help us to try and understand which countries on the continent are getting their startup acts or policies right, and what tangible impact have they seen in terms of having a startup act, or really being intentional about how you actually support startups and high growth startups at that.
Okay, so you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to have to read some stats off my phone. Otherwise, I'm going to get it completely wrong. But just to kind of piggyback off the golden thread. In terms of policy is definitely the first positioning. Enforcement of the policy is the larger sort of dynamic, and this is where we need to start really positioning our thinking. For example, we had the data privacy policy in South Africa pre-COVID, right? So we were very bold in terms of having it and the rest of it. How effective is it to date in terms of protecting us as the end consumer from a digital perspective? What we're seeing on a continental end of things is a larger adoption. So Tunisia was one of the first. Norman Freeman, you guys would know him. He was the minister back then, and he really championed for that to come to life. And they gave birth in terms of that. They basically saw a 25% in terms of inter-Africa tech exports happen because of that policy. They saw a 15% rise of VC deals that then occurred. And this literally went from 50 million to 200 million annually, okay, from a VC fund. Then they saw, in addition, a 10% reduction of failures within startups. And I think that was an important sort of stat for me, because we don't really appreciate the dynamics that a startup has to go through and the million amount of times that it has to fail before it actually has to succeed. So the net impact of all of this was labeling startups and certifying them as startups, okay, from a ministerial perspective or from a country perspective. That gave them credibility to then walk into the global corridors as such. The second bit was they saw an increase of over 5,000 jobs, especially in the fintech era, in the first year of the policy then being implemented. In addition to that, there we go, they saw IP filings, the intellectual property filings increase by 40%. Okay, and this was just all within the first year again. So I think they stand as a great testament. Another is Senegal, who followed in 2019 in terms of their Startup Act. They saw a raise of 18% in the MSMEs, digital adoption. So that means there was a larger inclusion of the technology component to help SMMEs or MSMEs, right? Then we had seen a 12% of GDP contribution to the GDP from e-commerce platforms alone, okay? And this was largely due to the inter-Africa trade. This was also as a result of the boom of the e-commerce industry at that point in time. This then led to over 3,000 youths being employed, as well as a saving of tax-free savings of over 20 million rands, particularly in the agricultural tech space. Okay, so again, I can go into very details. I have things around Nigeria, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, all whom have positioned themselves in terms of having a functional startup ecosystem, either bill policy strategy in place that is quite effective. Maybe Cote d'Ivoire is an interesting one, being East Africa, being a very small country, but how many of you have traveled to Cote d'Ivoire? Okay, so you guys would agree with me that the passion on ground is relentless. Okay, people are giving up their, president or vice presidency titles at large corporates to go ahead and bet on themselves. They have this relentless attribute for 1,000% on themselves. And I think that's the ingrained culture attribution that we can definitely learn from them in terms of that. Ethiopia, Morocco, Rwanda, and Kenya are obviously some of the other examples that can come to light. But I think I won't go into all of those details, but I'm happy to supply you guys with all of that research that we've done around it in terms of extracting some of those golden nuggets that may be required. An interesting sort of fact that I came across probably about 6 months ago, so was a study done by AFDB. And it says that within the continent, it can literally contribute $500 billion to our GDP from a startup perspective. Guys, $500 billion. Okay, this is by 2030. Okay, or sorry, 2035. So it gives us a time span of 10 years to play around with. But that's the potential that each one of us have in terms of that. In addition to that, there is a creation of jobs of over 30 million jobs from that industry alone by 2035. So I think the numbers definitely speak for themselves. It's about, do we have the will to actually see ourselves to that end line and, yeah, reap the benefits of it. Sorry for the long-winded.
I think that is so impactful. And just before I let you go, if you had to almost recommend what South Africa could do in terms of actually making sure that we position our startup policy in order to be able to really gain all of those benefits, or at least, a percentage of those benefits, what would you say the key aspect is that we need to consider?
So I think enforcement is definitely the next narrative that needs some focus. So how do we hold ourselves accountable in this long-term vision of it? I think adding transparency through the ecosystem is really critical and important. So transparency around investments, transparency around actual impact, transparency around from the time a founder is promised money to the time they actually get it in their bank accounts, to you name it, but literally just transparency, generally speaking, in that ecosystem. Another area is we, within the African Union in June, we put out something called the Startup Model Law. And I would encourage South Africa to really look at the alignment to that, which really helps to support the continental sort of mind frame and initiative. But I think it also helps to align in terms of what is required on ground within the South African environment. I would also encourage, rather than having multiple different policies, so you have a data policy, you have a fintech policy, you have a startup policy, you have an AI policy, you have a blockchain policy. Guys, can we just come together as part of all the different ministries, okay, and agree upfront on a South African sort of national policy or framework that is required to navigate all these different emerging technologies or frontier technologies, right? And then those particular ministries or departments can go ahead and niche it into their particular environments, okay? Because I think that is definitely a hindrance. In addition to that, I think I helped South Africa with the AI policy and the formation of that. We saw convenings happening. We went through the process, and 18 months later, we don't have it published. So it's a long, drawn-out process, and 18 months in an AI space, guys. Can we just get real for a minute? That's like a really long time frame to miss out the window, golden opportunity. So maybe Melvin, we can try to champion a lot more in terms of that digital transformation and getting some of those things across the line. Yeah, just some of the sort of initial thinkings. Yeah, but thanks for the question.
Thank you. I saw a lot of people nodding in the audience, so 100% on the right track. So I think the entrepreneurs in the room would like one policy, or at least something where they can go to one place and just to sort of see. Yeah.
Can I maybe just add things like digital passports for startups or startup passport is important, right? And that's something that we should look at. It's literally an endorsement for South African-based, endorsed startup companies to go and do work, whether it's within the continent from an inter-Africa perspective or even on a global scale. Yeah, that was just one added
And then over to Sanjay, a question for you. So obviously you're on the SA startup policy side of things, and in terms of trying to make sure that it actually delivers, not just in writing, but just the results for the founders and the entrepreneurs, how do you think, what do you think the key aspects are that we need to consider?
Thanks, Shelley. I just want to pick up one of the points that I guess you just mentioned now. So I've been part of one of the task forces as part of SU20. Pumzile, I've got somewhere else, probably one or two others. We've put out a number of key recommendations to the department. Digital passport was one of those. And the startup definition, amongst many. Each of our policy recommendations span 100 pages each times 5. Key recommendations were anything between 5 to 10 per task force. Fuiswa, getting it right? Yeah. We put out 40 to 50 recommendations in the startup space. And they asked us to streamline it to 2. Yeah. Shelley, just to answer your question, and you speak about policy.
Can you shortcut to what the 2 recommendations were? Sorry, I just put you on the spot.
I'm not going to do that only because we're actually not sure what's ultimately got approved. That's being tabled at G20 this weekend. So if I say something, somebody's going to come after me. Just to answer your question around policy, and perhaps I'm going to start with a statement. Policies don't fail in the writing. They fail in the execution. So we must design execution from day one. So I'm just starting off with that. You've spoken a lot about transparency, and I guess for us, that is a key thing. There's got to be transparency in the process around the policy design. The minister's spoken a lot about a lot of things, but at the time the policy is implemented, there's got to be transparency. There's got to be accountability around what's happening, who's doing what, whatever the case may be. So one of the suggestions I have is probably 3 or 4. Just from a delivery perspective, the department could think about setting up a startup policy delivery unit that basically oversees all the work that's happening in the space, including things like budgets, priorities, formal MOUs, involving other key stakeholders from other government departments, but being a custodian for what's happening in the startup space. So that's the first thing. As the Startup Act movement, I think we've got 2 or 3 big roles. I'm going to talk about 2 in particular. Over the last 10 years, we've been actively engaging with government around putting in place a startup policy, a startup act. Matsi's been the champion from many, many years. You've been part of that process earlier on. It's taken us 10 years, and we've probably got another 12 months to go, based on what the minister said. I'm trying not to overquote the minister. I guess as the Startup Act movement, we do have a couple of roles to play. We can obviously act as a co-designer of the policy, which we have been doing over a while. We can support the watchdogging of the policy. Somebody needs to oversee what happens in terms of the policy, the governance, and the implementation. And we can also act as the bridge between various stakeholders, government, the private sector, investors, global markets, and the like. The second role that we see ourselves playing, and we've put this forward, so I'm sharing something not overly confidential. Matsi may just kick me out just now. We are talking to 2 or 3 government departments around putting in place a couple of pilots, in particular sandbox environments. And I think that is something that allows government to test thinking and to assess how it's practically going to work. So the notion of sandboxing, particularly in a pilot type environment, is something we think could work. I'm not going to pick up on this aspect around transparency. I think you've spoken a lot about that already. I guess the overarching thing for me is bringing everybody together under a single umbrella, not only government. You've spoken about the notion of government. Let's not have 5 or 6 different government departments doing their own thing. Somebody's got to be the custodian. So that's the first thing. The ecosystem is bigger than the government. And there is a role for investors, entrepreneurs, and the private sector to play a role. The minister challenged us early on. Have we read some of the acts and policies out there? But the only way we contribute is you've got to arrive at the table contributing something. And we can't leave it on government to say, put in place something we're going to follow. Every single key stakeholder does have a role to play. And the question everybody's got to ask yourself, what role can you play to influence what policy government puts in place?
Thank you, Sanjay. Yes, I think go back to the table and read the policies to start, maybe. But yes. And then on to you, Nadia. From your perspective, what's quick wins or best practices from the G12's digital economy recommendations do you think South Africa could adopt to make it easier for startups really to grow and scale?
So I think there were two that I'll highlight. There were many from the B20 task forces, especially on the digitization. But the one was around access to devices and around affordability of connectivity. And I think if you can get those two right very early on, whether it's no tax for devices coming in. Now imagine what that happens. It basically, I don't know what's the import duty on devices, but that suddenly makes it super affordable for people to get access to devices. Then you reduce the cost of internet and proper connectivity. And then you've got a really beautiful combination of people being able to connect themselves to the world and to new opportunities and possibilities. And for entrepreneurs, that's what they're looking for. Not just high-end entrepreneurs that are building unicorns, but also the entrepreneurs that are sitting in rural communities to give them access to actual digital market opportunities, right? Because when you give them the devices, the training, the access, at an affordable price, it opens up that now they not just have a market in Pudadichaba, now they've got a whole market in Gauteng, they've got a market in the Western Cape, they can use e-commerce platforms. That changes the fundamental dynamics of entrepreneurs entirely.
Thank you. Melvin, I'm going to ask you a little bit. You mentioned about the president appointing you, and can you just tell us a little bit about what your role is there? What are they trying to achieve? And really, I guess, as the people in the room, is there anything we could do to support you to be able to play that bridge between essentially government policy and what the private sector and the entrepreneurs are actually looking for government to do?
No, thank you very much. And there's definitely something that everyone in the room can do from that perspective. The context of the roadmap was ultimately, I think, highlighted during COVID, where when as a country we were trying to, for example, pay our SRD grants, the 350 Rand grants that the government paid, and just being able to means test someone and to actually get them a payment was something that was more difficult than it really should have been compared to our other peers. And so really, we put out a roadmap. I'd say read it, but I don't know if you read much on the So we put a roadmap through cabinet in March earlier this year, and ultimately it shows the journey over the next few years of what we want to digitize. But it starts off with digital public infrastructure. What are the Lego blocks that we can use to actually transform digital services? So having a digital identity, digital payments, having a data exchange. And ultimately, the intention is that you should have, one person, one touch, one government. I find it hard to find that if you look at our government websites, we have about 200 out there. You look like you're in different countries. You go to one website, you're logging with one single sign-on, one with a different password. And so it's about saying, how do we take away the friction in actually interacting with government? And so my career objective is to create 100,000 jobs. And what you realize when you're in government, the impact and the scale of what you do. We're doing some work now with SASSA and Home Affairs. And the scale of government is so true. So when you think about like AI as an example, if you're able to bring AI into government services, that is so broad-based in terms of impact that you can have. And what we also remember as entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs are people. And so all of us at some point ago in the past, things are changing, would have gone to Home Affairs and stood in a line for the whole morning trying to renew a passport or an ID. And so by digitizing services, the intention is that it does free up time of citizens who are entrepreneurs who can actually focus on doing what they do. But from an entrepreneurship perspective, it really comes down to focusing on, as I stepped out early to speak to the minister, is what are the key things that we can do at the presidency and National Treasury to actually unlock blockers for entrepreneurs, whether that's registering for particular passes or licenses, whether that's getting payments done. What can we do as a sector for SMMEs? Because what you see in other countries, especially in India, like think about India, when they unlocked UPI, which is the UPI on the payment side, but even Brazil picks on payments, but even Aadhaar, the identity. What that meant for fintechs and KYC, then that's why they flew, because the cost of KYC in South Africa is very high right now. If we get really correct with our digital public infrastructure, we should minimize that cost, which then therefore lower the barrier for startups and others in that space. And so I think one, how can you contribute? I think one, read the policy and engage. But I think definitely when we do start prototyping and sandboxing elements, please do give feedback. because ultimately we can build in isolation, but we're building for the citizens ultimately.
Thank you. Honourable Ambassador, I think the last question is for you. And really it talks about where we look at the startup policy and really what's being done across the continent. How do we collaborate better with other jurisdictions across the continent that have either had lessons learned, this worked, this didn't? Yes, we're going to have to make it more very specific for South Africa, but at the same time, it would be crazy not to learn from other jurisdictions. And how do you propose that we do that?
Yeah, so first I think is sharing our research that we've gotten in terms of the continental view that can help shape the South African policy as to where it needs to go, and what are the outcomes that the South African startup policy wants to achieve. So it's not just getting a policy, it's being very intentional. Do we want to, for example, reduce the failure rate of startups? Do we want to add to the GDP of the country? Do we want, let's become very intentional about where we want to end up. I think the second bit is let us perhaps find a way, and maybe South Africa could be the first sort of home ground environment that we test this in, but perhaps there are areas from a continental-wide perspective that we can start looking at. So, like I mentioned in the investment space, maybe let's put together a real-time dashboard view of what investments look like on the continent at any given point in time. So a simple map where you can hover over, understand the split, understand, what's being invested where, and that automatically starts to give transparency to the LPs, to other VCs, global ones, an area in terms of wanting to connect. So they understand that, Africa is not as undecisive as AI. It is rather, we're being very deliberate and very intentional in terms of where we're going. And I think also it's highlighting our successes. We don't do that enough, okay? So, for example, and forgive me if you guys have heard me say this or share this example with you, but it was about 8 years ago, met a 16-year-old, in the middle of Uganda, had become orphaned and, was there with his grandmom in terms of looking after the farm. And he invented an AI tool that could help in terms of crop predictions, leaf predictions, the health of the crops and the rest of it. It helped his grandmom in terms of running the farm at 16, okay? And then the neighbors started using it, okay? As we are in Africa, right? We love our community and we love sharing, right? But at 16, that wasn't enough, okay? He went to the telcos and he negotiated a zero-cost rate for the farmers to utilize that app. Okay, so again, I think our value and our impact that we can create through our examples become very meaningful, right? Or whether or not it was, I had a South African that flew into Algeria because I was there at that point in time to showcase, a LLM model to me, right? And literally screen half broken, but they're busy, they're working, and literally within, I think a matter of 20 minutes got the model to, move into a particular direction that we were wanting it to. So, I think the want and the desire and those little foundational blocks is something we need to really earmark and find a way of supporting and highlighting at that continental level.
Before I hand over to the audience, I'll give you each a minute. And my initial question was, how can government partner with the private sector? But actually, I'm going to switch it around and say, how can the private sector partner with government in terms of the role that you do to be able to make this SA startup policy a success? I'll start with you, Sanjay.
Thanks, Shelley. The SA Startup Act movement is a good place for you to come and join. Sorry, where's my other bosses here? Now, I think if you think about the end objective, there's a shared and common vision, which is, as the private sector, as the ecosystem, we want to have in place a policy that we can work with. So I think the first thing is have this mindset that we are co-creating something with government to put in place for our benefit in the first instance, right? So do your part in doing that, which is basically get access to the documentation, share your views, contribute to the process of setting the policy, engage with us, because if you do engage, somebody is going to take account of the view that you've put across the table. And the way we're seeing it is that we are co-creating with government a policy that's going to work for startups.
I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what our role, what we think government should be doing, and there's an over-reliance in South Africa specifically on the role of government as the key provider for everything. And at WOMHUB, we took a stand about 10 years ago where we said we will always engage with government as the guys who come and cut the ribbon, and we will do the work, right? and therefore the photo ops and the engagement. But I think when I meet startups from outside of South Africa, everybody is hustling and they all want to get into corporates, they want to sell to corporates, the engineers want to go and work for corporates. In South Africa, you meet young people and everybody wants to work for government and they want to sell to government. And I think we've got to just expand and understand that yes, government is a massive employer and a massive opportunity, but we need to understand fundamentally that they are the guys that create the framework and the policy in which we operate it. Don't expect everything from them.
I'd probably say two things. I think, first of all, often when you hear bad things about South Africa, it's often South Africans that start that narrative. And you would have seen the journey that was up earlier, how far, for example, we've come with the Startup Act. And often people won't necessarily update their understanding. And so therefore, we will spew things that aren't true and there's no progress taking place, yet things are moving, albeit not the pace you want, but things are moving. And so first, I think, as citizens, not in private sector, how do we actually be the bearers of good news and actually keep up to date with things we're actually getting in terms of runs on the board, as it were? I think the second one, which has been very refreshing for me, I mean, I'm a capitalist, I'm an investor, I'm an entrepreneur, and it's been humbling being in government because the impact one can have in government and working with government is immense. And so when I spoke to the president about the work we want to do, I said that, look, I don't want it to be only government, I want it to be an SA Inc. project. And so it's important for us, I think, in both public and private sector to come together and say, like, look, how can we contribute in whatever way to the work that's happening? And so we can also cut ribbons, but also you can actually put your shoulder to the actual grind and get things going. I think that's where we can participate.
So from our side, we've seen on a continental and a global space, things change slightly different. So if we look at AI as an example, we went from encouraging it to, starting to say that it needs to be safe, right? And we saw the declaration being signed and the rest of it, to now saying that it needs to drive impact, okay? And India is hosting, I think in February, the India Impact Summit, AI Summit. And on all of these sort of facets that we go through, it's very clear that impact is still the end goal. Always was and always will be. So it is allowing corporates and private sector to understand that, that's first and foremost the common narrative that we come to the table together with, right? And second to that, it's what is required to open up the areas for them. So for example, if we're talking about, the startup ecosystem, and having connectivity as a human right, okay, which is something that I advocated for, just a couple of weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, together with WSIS Plus 20. Those are like key fundamentals that I'm gonna say to us as a group, as much as we focus just on startups, we gotta think about the wider issues that we can also influence as a net impact in the shortest space of time. So if we can get connectivity to be a human right, or can we get infrastructure to be done in a very smart way where you have, for example, a decentralized environment for computation where someone like you and I can actually start earning an income from having a GPU sitting in my house that's connected to solar, right? Like these are the ways and the areas that we've got to really start pushing ourselves in terms of being super innovative, right? But, so I think we can't go alone in terms of our journey. Corporates and, the private sector is very much part and parcel of that narrative. They have created, tenfold environments, whether it is, on jobs or liquid upskilling or the rest of it. But again, it's looking at the entire ecosystem. So at university level, or even before university level, because kids today are on robo-blocks, and guess what? They're entrepreneurs even at high school levels, right? So from high school level to university to, being the bridge coming out of university in terms of internships and apprenticeship programs, or even post that in terms of the, corporate world. What are we actually doing along that entire value chain to really start supporting the larger narrative that is actually required? And I think, my sort of last parting word would be, let's be super bold in terms of where we want to get to. Because I think it's really achievable. And, with you guys being very close to the finish line, let's just go all in.
Thank you very much. So just checking with Phumzile, we've got questions from the audience, is that right? 15 minutes. Oh, lots, okay. Wow, okay. Okay, so you were first because I saw your hand go up immediately.
Thank you very much. So I just want to drill down on what Sanjay said around the fragmentation of funding, where every department has got some startup fund, but you find that they're not equipped, they don't have any knowledge around disbursement of funds. I think we are suffering as a country, we're suffering from an identity crisis where we are stuck between communism, capitalism, all the isms, such that we actually have no idea what we're doing, because you find we are taking startup money and trying to solve SASSA problems, where we're saying that entrepreneurship is the vocation of last resort because somebody cannot get a job, therefore, but we know that that's not true, right? According to the startup mindset. So wouldn't it be that as Simodisa and all of us, we can actually rally behind consolidation of these funds such that government plays the convening role, it plays as an LP, give money to Melvin, to Nadia, to actually disburse, right? Because you find that as long as we are having every department having a fund, we're just creating a bigger surface area for corruption. That's why we have your Ket Matlalas and stuff like that, as opposed to actually having a centralized fund. So that fund that Minister Tao is forming, it should actually sit with Minister Stella, because if you look, for example, like in Rwanda, if you talk startup ICT, you know that there's Minister Paula, no one else. So there's too much noise. So we just have to have consolidation, and they play the position of LP. I don't know if you agree with me, Sanjay. Thank you.
Can I have a stab at that? I guess all of us spoke about two things, right? Clarity of definition around the startup policy. And we as the private sector and ecosystem players need to contribute to that, and government will take that into account. I think that's the first thing, right? You spoke about the SASSA money, funding going towards solving SASSA type problems, right? I think in terms of funding, I think you're quite right in that there are various pockets of funding sitting across various parts of government. From a startup perspective, and I'm specifically honing in on that only, there's got to be an ultimate government custodian from a policy perspective. And that's what we're putting forward. So if it's sitting in the Department of Small Business Development, the Office of Startups needs to sit in there and be a central point for coordination of various efforts, not only the funding allocation. As well, we've got to think a bit wider. We're not solving a single problem, which is funding. We're solving multiple problems. But ultimately, the custodian needs to sit at a single point dealing with the needs of what we're going to term startups.
Yeah, hi. It's Caroline Ongetsbach from the Sustainable Tourism Partnership Program, the Rural Aerodrome Company, and a couple of others. I live rural. I made a decision to leave Sandton and move to the Northern Cape, because in Sandton I can't make a difference, but in the Northern Cape I can. And I've been there for 5 years. And for 8 years, I've been trying to negotiate with my municipalities, okay, to build an airport, okay, not one airport. I want to build a whole network of airports. And with that brings in the education for the children and the youth. There's no maths and science being taught in the schools, okay? So we've taken it upon ourselves that we've got an aftercare kind of program, reading Monday, maths Tuesday, chess Wednesdays, maths and science and biology on Thursdays. And because we live in the Karoo, we look at the stars on a Friday. And the most amazing thing is that the kids that have gone through that little program, which is self-funded, the kids, the lowest mark in any subject the kids got was 47%. So we, just in our little aftercare program, have taken the kids from 20% or just passing or not wanting to go to school. We've got kids that didn't want to go to school, that didn't go to school for 2 years, that are on the program, that are now going back to school. So we need support on that kind of level in the rural areas. And the municipalities need to understand what tech investment actually can do for the municipalities and for their communities. And that must also be part of a policy. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask from a point of view from how competition, economics, or regulation could actually assist in terms of startup, because I understand because I'm in competition economics, and I just published a few papers on the barriers to entry that I experienced in South Africa, particularly in the emerging farming, because now we know that it's going commercially, being imported, big corporates bringing in, leaving out the local people to do that. So I wanted to find out how can competition regulation in terms of implementation and regulating how the business operate can be actually used to help startups as well, because I know it's a bit broad, but I wanted to see how that can directly be linked, because regulation, especially in the AI space, is quite important, and it's being isolated. Good, access is there, but how are the big corporates going to be going into this new market and gatekeeping still? So trying to desegment those two segments and make sure that there is regulation.
I would have preferred you answer a bunch of questions. If I may. No, thanks. My name is Neville. I've got two questions. The one is how the Startup Act movement or the process fits into bigger processes. There's the African Free Trade process. It's a huge, bigger than startup. It's a big thing. African Union stuff. In South Africa, there are bigger social or macroeconomic things being spoken about. And the question always is, where does, which is a policy, a strategy, an instrument around startups, how does that fit into the bigger things? Because if you don't address that, you are shouting in a chamber, and we may win a couple of things, but you are not fitting into much bigger processes. The minister spoke about geopolitics, for example. It's another one. So we can clap ourselves on the back that we have achieved 1 or 2, 3 things, but it is not finding entry into the bigger things that are happening or the bigger things that are needed. He makes the point about SASSA needs. If you don't speak about that, because that is the bigger problem, that is the bigger need, the socioeconomic needs of ordinary people. So if you don't place startup movement, strategy, policy, instruments in the context of that, then you may miss the boat. The second more positive one is what would be the markers for Sibodisa in the next 10 years of success? What would be those things? Can you list them for us? It can't just be the act in 12 months. It has to be other things. And what are those ones? Thanks.
All right. Hello, everyone. Dumelang. My name is Botella Beloy, and I am the CEO and founder of IMCO AI. I'm 22, and essentially my team and I are building an offline government AI model for the South African government and the public. So that means Wi-Fi, or that means AI access without Wi-Fi, data, and even works during load shedding. So my question, essentially when the Department of Home says the system is offline, it still works. So my question is, how can founders effectively communicate to investors the challenges of setting revenue milestones in markets where government procurement cycles, such as South Africa, can take 24 to 36 months?
Thank you. I'll give the panel an opportunity to try and respond. And if we have any more time, we'll give questions.
I'm happy to open up the bidding with the last question from the CEO of IMCO AI. Wearing different hats, and I think it's interesting where GovTech and government technology is a sphere of its own. And I think it's about finding investors who actually have either built or understand the space you're in. Because a GovTech investor knows that governments are their own beast. They take time, but when the numbers get large, they get very large with lots of zeros at the end. And so I think it's about working with investors who actually understand what you're building and the complexities of it. I think the reality is at early stage, as I mentioned earlier, for me as an investor, I focus on the quality of the entrepreneur. Because the reality is you'll pivot, you'll change, you'll hit roadblocks. It's about, do you deeply understand your problem and are you passionate about it? And I think good investors, like some are in the room now who I've co-invested with, I think understand that. So I think often just question whether you're speaking to the right people if they're asking those kind of questions.
I'm going to deal with your question around Simodisa, so perhaps I'm just going to go one big step back. It is a private sector-driven movement bringing together the private sector to advance the needs of startups. Been around for 10 years. I'm not shooting government down, but I'm just saying, I guess I'm going to state something factually. It's taken us 10 years to get here, not by our doing or undoing, right? But particularly in the last 18 months, we've had a couple of big wins. And it was mentioned earlier, I just want to highlight two of them, right? The digital nomad visa, we were front and center of putting that in place, and it took us a period of time to put it in place. We don't shout about these things because we see it as our contribution back into the economy, back into, I guess, the startup ecosystem. So I guess that's the first thing. Secondly, about a year ago, we started to further engage with the department, which has got us to this point where we have more line of certainty around a policy being in place in the next 12 months. The draft that's currently out there has had elements of input taken into account by us into the draft policy. Again, it's not something we are shouting about. I guess the point I'm making is that there has been progress, and again, I'm not faulting government. The private sector is doing all that we practically can to get things done. As an example, Melvin, from time to time, we would actually engage with him to say, sitting in the position where you are, can we support, can we influence, can we tell you from the ground, from the startup feedback we are getting, what is that feedback? He could take that forward. So I take your question, and I'm just giving you some feedback around what's happening. You asked me a 10-year question. Nobody can, I guess, talk about much beyond the next 24 months. I'm going to talk about the next 12 months. Our primary goal is to work with government and the private sector to put in place the startup policy. If we achieve that, not if, when we achieve that, we would have achieved a lot. And that's the private sector involvement.
I'll address the two quick questions about Northern Cape, and we've worked in Kuruma and Hotteshouse, Sishan, like a bunch of places. And I think what people fundamentally don't understand is when you want to put mega infrastructure in a place that doesn't have a massive economy to sustain it, you're going to create white elephants. And so government has to understand that, and we as entrepreneurs to understand that as well. So everybody asks me, Nadia, I need big tech startups in the Northern Cape. You're not going to get them, right? Because there isn't a market for it there. And so how do you build that market? And you have to have a vision. So sometimes working with municipalities that are small and undercapacitated, it's better to work with the big companies that are based there that actually need the skills and the expertise, right? And we work with Kumba, we used to work with South 32, etc. So I think you maybe potentially need to look at a different process in terms of support. For me, the competition question is really incredible, because how do you disrupt big tech? And I think South Africa's created interesting models where the companies have come in reluctant to do BE ownership, and they've basically put aside millions to be able to get South African startups into the space instead of ownership. But what I think is even more interesting is sometimes you don't want to be the first. You want to be the first second. And if you think about like OpenAI versus DeepSeek, and if you're following the AI race, right, DeepSeek has done what OpenAI has done, but at a fraction of a cost and a fraction of the team. And so sometimes we need to let the big players come in, fight it out, and then when the dust settles, us as entrepreneurs, they would have already spent all that money on R&D. We can come in and take up the opportunities. So sometimes we sometimes just need to wait a little bit.
So just continuing with the competition question, I think for us it's important to have an environment that actually allows competition to thrive. Okay, so what do we mean from a tech perspective? We mean open data ecosystems. So let's take the financial sector within South Africa. You don't have telcos talking to banks, you don't have banks talking to fintechs, you don't have, like that whole complete model, okay? And we can push that even further. We don't have, telcos talking to retailers, right? Because that space is becoming so blurred in terms of embedded financing and DeFi, right? So I think having an open data ecosystem is one of the foundational things that is required to allow for, competition to thrive. In terms of, your question from a macro perspective, I would say, can we put in a section in the South African startup policy where we align it to the likes of your Agenda 2063 or to the startup model law that the AU has, or to how, it'll benefit the AFCTA, right? So there's lots of different programs with lots of different things going on. But how do we tie it back to continental net effect, I think is your point. And it's a very welcome point. And just as a sort of parting thought, since the process takes such a long time from a strategy to a policy to a legislation, in the context of South Africa, can we not do all three at the same time? So as you're thinking of just, having the startup policy, can we not also engage with, Parliament to, start drafting that legislation and what that exactly would look like? So that we're not doing duplicate efforts, because it's the same group of people with the same voices, right, that would be represented in those rooms. So perhaps that's an area that we could look at as well.
Thank you very much. I think that wraps it up from everybody. So I'd like to give my panelists a big round of applause, if you don't mind. And thank them very much for joining, and thank you so much for the questions. Thank you.
And the fantastic panel. That was a lot of good insights, right? Hello? Are we still together? We're still together. It has been a long morning. I think we are due for a body break. We are trying to still get you out of here by 1 o'clock, so we will manage the breakaway and feedback session to probably about 30 minutes each. So now we'll take a 15-minute break. When you get back, you're not going to be coming back in here. You're going to be going into the room opposite from here, which is the conference center, where you'll be divided into 5 groups, and then we'll do a 30-minute brief group work. I'll let you know after the break. Thank you.